At dawn on July 1st, 1916, the Somme Valley awoke to a thunder unlike anything the world had ever heard. It was not the rumble of storms or the roll of distant thunder, but the eruption of thousands of guns, a cacophony that split the sky and shook the ground. For 7 days, the Allied bombardment had hammered German positions without pause. And now, at 7:30 in the morning, whistles blew and tens of thousands of British infantry climbed out of their trenches. They marched forward into the open fields of northern France with confidence born of promises that the enemy had been obliterated, that barbed wire had been shredded, that machine guns had been silenced. But within hours, the fields were littered with bodies, their hopes drowned in fire. Nearly 60,000 British soldiers were casualties on that single day, 19,000 of them killed outright. It was the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army, and it was only the beginning of the Battle of the Somme. The men who stepped onto that battlefield could not have known what awaited them. For many, this was their first taste of combat. They came from towns and villages across Britain and the Empire miners from Yorkshire, clerks from Manchester boys who had played football on cobbled streets or worked together in factories. Many served in Pals Battalions units, formed from men of the same community. They had enlisted together, trained together, and now faced death together. For them, the battle was not an anonymous clash of armies, it was deeply personal. When entire battalions were cut down, whole neighborhoods at home would mourn together, empty chairs at dinner tables stretching down streets, church bells tolling for sons, brothers and fathers lost all at once. The Somme itself was no grand prize. It was not chosen for its strategic importance nor for any industrial riches it contained. The valley, cut by a slow-flowing river and bordered by rolling farmland, had been a quiet sector of the Western Front. Yet, by the summer of 1916, it became the center of the war's greatest gamble. For 2 years, Europe had bled in stalemate. From the Channel coast to Switzerland stretched an unbroken line of trenches, fortified by barbed wire machine guns and artillery. The war had become a war of position, where frontal attacks usually meant mass slaughter for the attackers. Then came Verdun. In February 1916, Germany launched a colossal offensive against the French fortress city, aiming to bleed France dry. The battle raged for months, consuming hundreds of thousands of lives. The French High Command begged their allies for relief. And so, what had been planned as a joint Franco-British offensive along the Somme shifted into something else entirely. France, drained by Verdun, could only commit a fraction of the divisions originally promised. The burden fell instead on Britain, its largest operation of the war to date, carried out by an army still young and inexperienced. This was not a battle born of ambition, but of necessity. The Somme was chosen simply because it was where British and French armies met, where they could coordinate. It was, in the words of one general, a battle not sought, but forced upon us. For General Douglas Haig, commander of the British Expeditionary Force, it was an opportunity nonetheless. He believed that a massive blow could shatter German lines, allowing cavalry to ride through and transform the war from stalemate to movement. For the French, it was above all a means of survival, a desperate attempt to draw German strength away from Verdun. And so the stage was set. On the Allied side, the armies of two great powers united but strained. On the German side, a second army dug deep into chalk ridges and fortified villages waiting. Between them lay no man's land, a scarred and silent stretch of ground, soon to erupt in fire. The men who waited in the trenches of the Somme sensed the scale of what was coming. Letters written on the eve of battle reveal both optimism and dread. Some spoke with confidence, echoing the assurances of their commanders that the bombardment would leave nothing alive, that the attack would be easy. Others, more cautious, confessed their fears. Captain Charles May, a Manchester officer, wrote tenderly to his wife and infant daughter, "I do not want to die. The thought that I may never see you again turns my body to water. But if I must go, I hope to do my duty." His words would outlive him, carried home after he fell in the opening day's slaughter. The Somme was not only a military event, it was also a human tragedy that touched civilians in ways soldiers could scarcely imagine. French families who had not fled in 1914 still clung to their homes in the valley. They endured the thunder of artillery sheltering in cellars as walls cracked and windows shattered. Fields once rich with wheat were churned into wastelands of mud and craters. Livestock perished in the bombardments. Villages crumbled into rubble. For them, the Allied offensive promised liberation, but delivered devastation, their home sacrificed to the needs of strategy. When the whistles blew on that July morning, these threads converged: the desperation of France, the ambition of Britain, the endurance of Germany, the vulnerability of civilians, and the innocence of young men marching to their deaths. The Battle of the Somme was not the clash of giants it was imagined to be, but rather a crucible of attrition, born from necessity and fought at unimaginable cost. It is here on the Somme that the war's true nature was laid bare. Not quick victories or gallant charges, but grinding battles of mud, steel, and blood. And it is here that we begin our story of one valley, one summer, and one of the darkest chapters in human history. The offensive on the Somme was supposed to be a grand demonstration of Allied power, the kind of blow that would shatter the deadlock of trench warfare and open the road to victory. But from the very beginning, questions haunted the plan. The men who conceived it were divided in their aims, uncertain of what the offensive could realistically achieve, and perhaps blinded by their own hopes in the destructive power of modern weapons. General Douglas Haig, commander of the British Expeditionary Force, carried enormous responsibility. A cavalryman by training, he still believed in the possibility of a breakthrough, one great stroke that would smash through German lines, liberate occupied France, and unleash British horsemen into open country. For Haig, the Somme was more than just a supporting attack for the French at Verdun. It was an opportunity to prove Britain's army had come of age, that it could stand alongside France as a decisive partner in the war. His subordinate, General Henry Rawlinson, was less ambitious. Rawlinson, in charge of the British Fourth Army, saw no prospect of galloping breakthroughs. He argued instead for bite-and-hold tactics, limited advances that would seize a section of trench, consolidate it, and force the Germans into costly counterattacks. In his view, Britain's untested army could not hope to achieve sweeping victories. Its task was attrition, to wear the enemy down little by little. These competing visions shaped the plan. Haig pressed for a massive advance, hoping to reach the German second line on the first day. Rawlinson preferred caution. The compromise was uneasy: an enormous bombardment to pave the way, followed by an infantry attack across a 25-mile front. In theory, the artillery would flatten German defenses so thoroughly that infantry could walk forward almost unopposed. In practice, the assumptions were dangerously optimistic. The preparations were immense. More than 1,000 guns were hauled into position, many along newly built roads and railways. Shells were stockpiled in vast dumps, a mountain of steel awaiting its release. 19 mines were dug beneath German strongpoints, each packed with explosives, ready to erupt before the infantry advanced. Ammunition columns clogged the countryside, horses straining against loads of shells that seemed endless. Observers in London and Paris marveled at the scale of the effort, convinced that nothing could survive such firepower. Haig himself believed the battle could be won in days. He spoke confidently of reaching Bapaume, a town 10 miles behind the German line, by the end of the first week. Some of his officers even speculated about the cavalry galloping toward Cambrai and beyond. The image of a war of movement so long denied by trench lines still haunted their imaginations. But others were skeptical. Some British officers worried about the inexperience of their men. Kitchener's new army was filled with volunteers who had trained for only 18 months. Brave and eager though they had never faced machine gun fire or massed artillery. One colonel wrote privately, "They are fine lads, but they are green. God help them when the storm begins." There were also doubts about the guns themselves. Britain had expanded its artillery at breakneck speed, but many crews were poorly trained, and many shells were of poor quality. Reports circulated that nearly 1/3 of the shells failed to explode. Worse, much of the ammunition consisted of shrapnel designed to kill men in the open, not destroy barbed wire or concrete. German dugouts sunk 30 feet into chalk and reinforced with timber would endure most of what the British hurled at them. But this truth was not yet clear to the planners. The Germans, for their part, were not idle. Their Second Army under General Fritz von Below had built an elaborate defensive system: barbed wire belts, machine gun nests, fortified villages, and deep dugouts made the Somme one of the strongest sectors on the Western Front. German soldiers, many veterans of earlier battles, believed they could hold against anything. Some wrote confidently to their families that the British were amateurs about to learn a terrible lesson. Yet, even among the Germans, the bombardment that began on June 24th shook nerves. For 7 days, more than 1 million shells poured down, tearing apart fields and villages, sending geysers of chalk into the sky. The ground quaked as though in earthquake. One German soldier described the fire as a symphony of hell so constant that it became a second heartbeat. Yet, when the barrage finally lifted, thousands of Germans climbed from their bunkers, shaken but alive, ready to man their machine guns. On the Allied side, the final days before the attack were filled with anticipation. Soldiers joked and sang, some believing the enemy was already crushed. Rumors spread that the advance would be easy, a walkover. One officer assured his men they would be in Bapaume in a week. Others felt a darker premonition. Captain Charles May, the Manchester officer who wrote of his wife and child, put it simply, "I must not dwell on the personal, but I cannot help it. I do not want to die." By the eve of the battle, everything was in place: the guns, the mines, the troops massed in their trenches. Rawlinson's Fourth Army prepared to attack across a 20-mile front, supported by French divisions to the south. A diversionary assault would be launched further north at Gommecourt. In total, more than 120,000 British soldiers were about to go forward, the largest single attack in the history of their army. The plan depended on one thing: that the artillery had done its work. If the bombardment had destroyed the wire, the machine guns and the dugouts, the infantry could advance with confidence. If not, they would be walking into a storm. As the last shells crashed down on the morning of July 1st, few of the men waiting in the trenches realized just how fragile their fate had become. In the weeks before the Somme offensive, the Allied armies gathered on a scale that the valley had never seen. The small farms and quiet villages along the river were transformed into staging grounds for the greatest concentration of men and material Britain had yet committed to war. For many soldiers, this was their first time in France. For others, it was their last. The heart of the British force was Kitchener's new army. 2 years earlier, in the summer of 1914, recruiting posters bearing the stern gaze of Lord Kitchener had called out, "Your country needs you." The response was overwhelming. Clerks left their desks, miners their pits, and students their classrooms. By 1916, these volunteers filled Britain's ranks in France. They were not professionals like the old contemptibles who had fought at Mons and Ypres. Most were inexperienced, scarcely 18 or 19 years old, still learning how to adjust straps and polish bayonets. Their courage was unquestionable, but their training often shallow. They knew drill, but few had faced the chaos of battle. Among them were the famed Pals Battalions. Whole communities had enlisted together: football clubs, groups of factory workers, even bands of schoolboys. The idea was that men who trained and fought with friends would fight with greater spirit. It gave the units a powerful bond, but also a hidden peril. When disaster came, it struck entire neighborhoods at once. Streets in Manchester, Sheffield, or Leeds would lose dozens of young men in a single morning. The pride of these battalions was real, but so was the risk that the same pride could hollow out whole communities back home. The Empire's presence was unmistakable. Australians hardened at Gallipoli brought with them a rough humor and a reputation for independence. Canadians eager to show they could stand with the best, prepared to enter the line. New Zealanders, South Africans, and Indian regiments filled the ranks, adding to the sense that this was not just Britain's battle, but one fought on behalf of a global empire. Each contingent carried its own identity and stories, yet on the Somme, they would share the same trenches, the same rations, and the same fate. The French contribution, though diminished by Verdun, remained significant. Veterans of Champagne and Artois held the southern flank. Among them were colonial units from Algeria, Morocco, and Senegal. Many of these men had traveled thousands of miles from homes in North Africa and West Africa to fight in a European war not of their making. Their presence was a reminder of how global the conflict had become, a war that consumed men from every corner of the earth. Opposite the Allies, the German Second Army prepared grimly. They had occupied the Somme since 1914 and had transformed it into a fortress. The chalky soil of northern France allowed them to dig deep shelters, some more than 30 feet underground, complete with timber supports, electricity, and telephone lines. These dugouts were stocked with food, ammunition, and machine guns. When the British bombardment came, these bunkers would save thousands of lives, allowing defenders to ride out the storm and re-emerge when the barrage lifted. German machine gun crews were positioned to cover every likely approach. their belts of barbed wire stretched across fields like iron forests designed to channel attackers into narrow gaps. Villages were fortified cellars turned into redoubts, and ruined farmhouses converted into firing posts. Behind the first trench lay a second, and behind that a third, each ready to absorb the attack. The doctrine was simple: hold every yard, counterattack immediately when ground was lost, and make the enemy pay in blood for every inch gained. The German soldiers who manned these lines were hardened veterans. Many had survived Ypres, the Argonne, or Champagne. They were not easily rattled, and their letters home reveal both resilience and bitterness. Some wrote that the British amateurs in war were about to learn the same lesson the French had learned at Verdun. Others confessed unease at the thunder of the Allied bombardment, which shook their nerves and reduced villages to rubble around them. Still, they trusted in their bunkers, in their machine guns, and in their discipline. Civilians still lingered in the valley as well. Some French families had refused to leave when the front first settled here in 1914. They had endured 2 years of shelling their farms, overrun by soldiers, their homes shattered. In June 1916, as the Allied buildup reached its peak, many finally fled carts piled high with bedding pots and children, those who remained sheltered in cellars, clinging stubbornly to the ruins of their villages. For them, the Somme was not a strategy or an operation, but the destruction of their lives. By late June, the stage was set. Along the 25-mile front, more than 1 million Allied soldiers were in position. Behind them stood mountains of shells, ranks of guns and horses, straining in endless supply columns. In the dugouts across no man's land, German veterans waited, their machine guns trained on the fields they knew would soon be filled with advancing men. And between them stretched a barren strip of earth scarred by shellfire, known simply as no man's land. The Somme was ready to erupt. The Battle of the Somme was more than a clash of men. It was a collision of machines, the meeting of old tactics with new technologies that had transformed warfare into something alien. For centuries, wars had been fought with maneuver and courage. On the Somme, courage still mattered, but the battlefield itself was dominated by the industrial tools of destruction. Artillery was the centerpiece. Along the British front, nearly 400 guns had been dragged into position field pieces, heavy howitzers, and the massive 9.2-inch and 15-inch monsters that hurled shells weighing hundreds of pounds. For a full week before the attack, these guns pounded the German lines without pause. More than 1.5 million shells were fired in 7 days, an average of one every second. The thunder could be heard across the Channel in southern England. The sky glowed red at night, and the earth trembled like an endless earthquake. The plan was simple: the guns would annihilate everything. The bombardment would shred the belts of barbed wire, crush the enemy's trenches, bury their defenders alive in dugouts, and obliterate their artillery. When the fire lifted, British infantry would simply walk forward and occupy what remained. Soldiers called it the Big Push. Generals spoke of a walkover. The language betrayed a dangerous optimism. But artillery was a blunt instrument. Many shells were duds buried harmlessly in the chalk. Others were the wrong type. Too many were shrapnel shells designed to kill men in the open, with sprays of steel balls rather than high explosive rounds needed to cut wire and demolish bunkers. Factories at home were producing shells at breakneck speed, but quality control often failed. One estimate later suggested that nearly a third of the shells fired failed to explode at all. For the men in the trenches, the bombardment was thunderous, but its effectiveness was uneven. The Germans, for their part, had prepared. Their engineers had dug deep shelters 30 feet down into the chalk, lined with timber and concrete. In these dugouts, entire companies could wait out even the heaviest fire. Telephone cables ran underground, linking frontline posts with command centers in the rear. When the barrage finally lifted, the defenders would simply climb the stairs, set up their machine guns, and fire into no man's land. And the machine gun was the true terror of the age. The Maxim and MG08 could fire 500 rounds per minute, a torrent of lead, capable of cutting down whole waves of advancing men. A single crew, well positioned, could halt a battalion. German gunners had perfected their craft, placing their weapons to sweep every approach. Once the British bombardment stopped, the machine guns would own the field. Barbed wire, too, was a weapon. Laid in thick belts, sometimes 9 yards deep, it forced attackers into narrow lanes where they became easy prey. Wire cutters were issued, but no man could clear obstacles under machine gun fire. The hope was that artillery would destroy the wire, but where shells missed the obstacles remained deadly. Poison gas added another layer of horror. Chlorine and phosgene shells were mixed into the bombardment, drifting green and yellow clouds across the battlefield. Soldiers wore crude masks with chemicals that stung their eyes and lungs. The masks were suffocating hot and difficult to see through. Gas was not always decisive. It shifted with the wind, sometimes blowing back on those who launched it, but its psychological effect was immense. Men feared it more than bullets, believing that even a breath could be fatal. The skies above the Somme also became part of the battle. Observation balloons tethered behind the lines provided a constant view of enemy positions. Aircraft, fragile biplanes of wood and fabric, flew over trenches to photograph defenses and direct artillery fire. The British Royal Flying Corps and the French Aéronautique Militaire faced German Fokker fighters in dogfights that left spirals of smoke drifting across the sky. For the first time in history, war on the ground was intimately tied to war in the air. All these weapons were intended to serve the infantry, the men who would cross no man's land with rifles and bayonets, grenades, and packs weighing 60 pounds. Each soldier carried not just weapons, but entrenching tools, rations, ammunition, and sometimes coils of wire or sandbags. They were burdened before they even began. The Somme was supposed to be their proving ground. For the new army battalions waiting in the trenches, the weapons of modern war were abstractions. They had drilled with rifles, fixed bayonets, and practiced charges across fields. Many still imagined war as their fathers had described it, an affair of bravery and momentum. What they would discover on July 1st was that bravery alone could not defeat artillery and machine guns. For commanders, the Somme was an experiment, though they did not call it that. They hoped massed firepower would succeed where maneuver had failed. They trusted technology to deliver them from stalemate. But the truth was more complex. The weapons of industrial war were blunt, imperfect, and terrifying. They consumed resources on a scale never seen before, and their effect was often indiscriminate. Civilian soldiers and even the earth itself were victims. The valley of the Somme, once green and fertile, was already scarred before the attack began. The week of bombardment had left villages in ruins, trees shattered into splinters, fields cratered as if by meteors. Animals lay dead in the mud. Streams were choked with debris. This was the new phase of war, not maneuver, not gallant charges, but destruction on an industrial scale where the battlefield itself became unrecognizable. In the days to come, the infantry would learn the true power of these weapons. They would step into no man's land believing the artillery had done its work, only to discover that barbed wire still blocked their path, that machine guns still waited, and that the enemy had survived underground. And in that revelation, the Somme would shift from plan to tragedy. By the last week of June 1916, the Somme Valley no longer resembled the quiet farmland it had once been. The landscape trembled constantly under the roar of artillery. Allied guns had opened fire on June 24th, and for 7 days, they poured shell after shell into the German lines. It was the greatest bombardment the world had yet seen, intended to break open the Western Front once and for all. To men in the trenches, the noise was overwhelming. "The earth shakes like a living thing," one soldier wrote in his diary, "and the air is thick with dust and the stink of cordite." Day and night the guns never ceased. Soldiers far behind the lines could not sleep, their cots rattling with each impact. Farmers in towns miles away watched their windows shatter as the thunder rolled across the countryside. The bombardment seemed to promise certain destruction for the enemy. The generals had told their men as much. They insisted the Germans could not possibly survive such fire. Leaflets reassured infantry that the barbed wire would be cut. The dugouts crushed, the machine guns buried. "You will be able to walk across," one officer promised, with rifles at the slope, as if on parade. The men listened. Some tucked footballs into their packs, vowing to kick them across captured trenches in triumph. The faith was genuine, but tragically misplaced. In truth, the bombardment was flawed. Many shells were duds, burying themselves harmlessly in the chalk. Too many were the wrong kind, shrapnel shells that scattered steel balls in the open, but could not cut wire or destroy bunkers. German engineers had sunk their shelters deep into the ground, some 30 feet down, stocked with supplies, and linked by tunnels. There, thousands of defenders waited, battered but alive. When the barrage lifted, they would climb back to their machine guns ready. The final night before the attack was heavy with anticipation. Soldiers wrote last letters home by candlelight. Some were filled with optimism, By the time you read this, we will be in Bapaume. One man told his family, naming a town far beyond the German lines. Others confessed to dread. Captain Charles May, a Manchester officer with a young wife and daughter, poured out his fears. "I do not want to die. The thought of never seeing you again turns me to water." He would not survive the day to come. Behind the lines, the build-up reached a fever pitch. Ammunition dumps stood piled high with shells. Ambulance wagons and stretcher-bearers rehearsed their routes. Chaplains moved through the trenches, offering prayers and quiet words of comfort. Field kitchens issued what might be the last hot meal many would ever eat. Officers checked their watches again and again, waiting for the appointed hour. On the morning of July 1st, the guns fell briefly silent. At 7:20 a.m., an enormous mine exploded beneath the German stronghold at Hawthorne Ridge. The blast hurled earth hundreds of feet into the air, a column of smoke and debris towering above the battlefield. The ground shook for miles, and men in nearby trenches stood frozen in awe. Minutes later, more mines erupted across the line, tearing open German positions in fountains of chalk and fire. At 7:30 a.m., whistles blew. Across a front nearly 20 miles wide, tens of thousands of British soldiers clambered out of their trenches, burdened with 60 pounds of equipment, rifles, bayonets, ammunition rations, water bottles, even shovels and coils of wire. They stepped forward into the pale light of dawn. Officers waved canes or revolvers to keep the lines steady. Men moved shoulder to shoulder as they had practiced in drills. For a brief moment there was silence. Then the German machine guns opened fire. The great gamble of the Somme had begun. At 7:30 on the morning of July 1st, 1916, the Battle of the Somme erupted in full. Across an 18-mile front, nearly 120,000 British soldiers climbed from their trenches and advanced into no man's land. They carried rifles with fixed bayonets, packs weighing 60 pounds, and the confidence instilled by 7 days of thunderous bombardment. Some were so certain the enemy was destroyed that they kicked footballs ahead of them as though it were a game. What awaited them was slaughter. From their deep dugouts, German soldiers had survived the storm of shells. As the barrage lifted, they rushed to their firing positions, machine guns already loaded and ranged on the fields before them. The air filled with the mechanical clatter of hundreds of barrels, unleashing torrents of fire. The advance, steady and orderly, at first dissolved almost instantly. Men fell in rows, whole platoons scythed down within minutes. The landscape became a harvest of bodies. In the north, near Serre and Beaumont-Hamel, the catastrophe was worst. The 29th Division, including the Newfoundland Regiment, rose from their trenches and pushed forward. Within half an hour, more than 700 of the 800 Newfoundlanders lay dead or wounded. They had advanced barely a few dozen yards before being cut to pieces. To this day, Beaumont-Hamel is remembered in Newfoundland as a national day of mourning. Elsewhere, similar tragedies unfolded. The Leeds Pals, the Accrington Pals, and dozens of other battalions drawn from factories and neighborhoods across Britain were wiped out in moments. In some places, German fire was so thick that officers could not raise their heads to give orders, and men pressed forward blindly only to be shot down before they reached the wire. The wire itself proved deadly. Where the artillery had failed to cut it, the belts remained intact, forcing soldiers into narrow gaps. These became killing zones where machine guns tore them apart. Those who tried to crawl through became entangled, helpless, their cries drowned in the roar of fire. Communication collapsed almost immediately. Telephone wires had been severed by shell fire. Signal flares went unseen in the smoke. Runners dispatched with messages often never arrived. Artillery tied to rigid timetables lifted its fire, regardless of whether infantry had advanced. In many sectors, the creeping barrage rolled ahead into empty ground, leaving the attackers stranded and exposed. Yet not everywhere was failure. On the British right near Montauban, French divisions, supported by better artillery, achieved success, capturing villages and pushing the Germans back. Some British units too seized footholds. Most famously, the Ulster Division stormed the Schwaben Redoubt near Thiepval, fighting hand-to-hand in German trenches. But their success could not be reinforced, and by nightfall they too were driven back. By evening, the scale of the disaster was undeniable. The British had suffered 57,000 casualties in a single day, nearly 20,000 of them killed. German losses, though severe, were far lighter, around 12,000. For Britain, July 1st was not just a defeat, it was a national trauma, the worst day in the history of its army. The survivors carried memories that would haunt them forever. One soldier later wrote, "To the left and right of me, men fell like corn before a scythe. After 20 yards, I was alone." Others described the cries of the wounded lying in shell holes, calling out for water as the sun rose higher, many of them left to die where they fell. Entire battalions disappeared in the fire. Communities back home would soon feel the shock as telegrams arrived by the thousands. The Pals experiment, sending neighbors and friends to fight side by side, had ended in tragedy. When a battalion was annihilated, so too was an entire town's young generation. For the generals, the day was both catastrophe and revelation. The Germans had not been destroyed, their defenses had held, and the war, it seemed, could not be won by bombardment alone. But for the men who had walked into the storm, those lessons came too late. The Somme had begun not with triumph, but with massacre. When night fell on July 1st, 1916, silence crept across the Somme battlefield, broken only by the moans of the wounded lying between the lines. Some had been pinned down since morning, unable to move, tangled in wire, or hidden in shell holes. Their cries of water stretcher carried faintly in the darkness. Stretcher bearers crept out under intermittent fire, dragging men back through mud and craters, but many were left behind. By dawn, thousands were dead where they had fallen, their bodies already beginning to stiffen in the morning chill. Behind the front, the scale of the calamity became clearer. Aid posts overflowed with wounded. Churches, barns, and schools were turned into makeshift hospitals. Cots jammed shoulder to shoulder. The air stank of blood and antiseptic. Nurses worked until their arms cramped, washing wounds, comforting the delirious, and closing the eyes of the dead. Surgeons cut and stitched by lamplight, performing amputations with barely enough chloroform to dull the pain. The wounded lay in rows, some crying out, some eerily silent, as the tide of casualties seemed never-ending. News traveled fast. Within 48 hours, telegrams began arriving in Britain. A knock at the door, a slip of paper, a message that was both curt and devastating: "Regret to inform you." The flood of notices stunned the nation. In mill towns, mining villages, and city neighborhoods, families gathered in grief. Some received multiple telegrams in a single day, losing brothers, fathers, and sons at once. Whole streets were plunged into mourning. The tragedy of the Pals Battalions magnified the pain. Because men had enlisted together, they fell together. A single morning wiped out entire football teams' factory shifts or school classes. In Accrington, a town in Lancashire, nearly every household had lost someone when the Accrington Pals were cut down. In Sheffield, grief was so widespread that shops closed and church bells tolled across the city. Communities that had marched proudly to the recruiting stations in 1914 were now hollowed out, their young men gone. In London, newspapers struggled with how to report the disaster. Early editions spoke of progress, emphasizing the successes of French divisions in the south. Only gradually did the scale of British losses emerge. When casualty figures were announced, the nation was stunned. One member of Parliament described July 1st as a wound that will never heal. The shock reverberated across the empire as well. In Newfoundland, word of the regiment's destruction reached families who had sent their sons across the ocean. Nearly an entire generation of young men from that small dominion was gone in less than an hour. The grief became a national memory, still commemorated each July 1st as Memorial Day. French civilians in the valley endured their own ordeal. Those who had clung to their homes now saw their villages obliterated. Roofs collapsed, walls crumbled, wells were poisoned with debris. Families fled westward with whatever they could carry: blankets, pots, and photographs, tucked into sacks, joining columns of refugees on muddy roads. Children cried in hunger, mothers wept in silence, fathers pushed carts piled high with their last belongings. For them, the battle that was meant to liberate had instead destroyed the little that remained of their world. Amid all this, soldiers at the front tried to make sense of what had happened. Some cursed their commanders, convinced they had been sent into slaughter blindly. Others hardened themselves, repeating that such losses were necessary, that the Germans were bleeding too. Letters home tried to reassure families, but the stains of mud and blood on the paper told another story. July 1st was the beginning, not the end. The offensive would continue, and the men knew it. Reinforcements marched forward to replace the dead. Guns were dragged closer, their barrels already worn thin. Officers studied maps of villages that were now nothing more than rubble, assigning objectives. As if the first day had never happened, the battle would grind on. But for Britain, July 1st was already seared into memory. It was not just another day of war. It was a national tragedy, a wound shared by towns, villages, and families across the nation. The Battle of the Somme had begun in fire and ended in mourning, and its echo would carry for generations. The slaughter of July Mers might have broken some armies, but on the Somme, it was only the beginning. The British and French pressed on, determined to salvage the offensive. What followed was not the sweeping breakthrough promised by the generals, but a series of brutal, localized battles, villages, ridges, and patches of woodland, fought over with relentless ferocity. Each was a world of its own, forgotten in the larger tide of the Somme, yet together they defined the summer of 1916. Mammitswood was one such place. The Welsh division was ordered to seize the dense thickets north of the village of Mammits. From a distance, the forest looked like a dark wall of trees, but inside it was a maze of undergrowth, shattered branches, and German machine guns hidden in every fold. The Welsh advanced in waves, and the woods swallowed them. The trees themselves became weapons, splintering under shell fire, hurling jagged shards into flesh. For days the fighting raged until the forest floor was carpeted with bodies. Survivors wrote of the horror of stepping on the dead, as they fought, of hearing the cries of wounded men echo under the canopy, of the smell of blood and sap mingling into one. When the wood was finally cleared, nearly 4,000 Welsh soldiers were gone. At Contalmaison, the battle was no less grim. The village was reduced to rubble, yet the German defenders clung to cellars and dugouts, turning each ruin into a fortress. British soldiers stormed the wreckage again and again, fighting room by room, often with bayonets and grenades. The village changed hands multiple times before it was secured, and even then the ruins offered little shelter. Men who crouched in the cellars found themselves buried alive when German shells collapsed the walls. La Boisselle became famous for the Lochnagar crater, where a mine of 60,000 pounds of explosives erupted beneath German positions, creating a crater 300 feet wide and 70 feet deep. The explosion was so vast that it was seen from the rear lines, a pillar of smoke and debris rising like a volcano. Yet, when the dust cleared, German machine gunners who had survived in deeper shelters opened fire. The crater became a death trap filled with bodies instead of victory. Throughout July, these battles were marked by innovation as well as tragedy. The creeping barrage artillery fire that advanced in timed lifts just ahead of the infantry was used with increasing precision. In theory, it created a moving wall of fire that shielded attackers. In practice, timing was everything. If the infantry lagged, the barrage rolled too far ahead, leaving them exposed. If they moved too quickly, they risked being torn apart by their own shells. At Mammits and Contalmaison, British gunners experimented, sometimes with success, often with error. Each mistake was measured in lives. The psychological toll mounted. Soldiers who survived bombardments described the ground itself as alive, quivering with constant fire. They spoke of the smell of corpses left unburied, of rats growing fat on human flesh, of nights broken by the cries of wounded men trapped in no man's land. Shell shock spread rapidly, men trembling uncontrollably, unable to speak, haunted by visions of falling shells even when far from the line. At the time, it was poorly understood, often mistaken for cowardice. Yet it was the invisible wound of modern war, as real as shrapnel or gas burns. For the Allies, each gain came at dreadful cost. A village taken, a wood cleared, a ridge occupied, every yard was paid for with hundreds of lives. Still, the fighting ground forward. The French on the southern flank achieved greater success. Their heavier artillery and more experienced troops allowed them to capture villages and push the Germans back. Their progress, though slower than hoped, was steady. It was the British who bled most heavily for minimal gains. By the end of July, the Somme was already a graveyard for tens of thousands. Yet the offensive continued, driven by necessity as much as strategy. To stop would be to abandon France at Verdun, to admit that the sacrifices of July 1st had been in vain. And so the Allies pressed on, village after village, crater after crater, into the heart of a landscape that no longer resembled Earth, but a vision of hell itself. For the Germans, holding the Somme line, July had been a month of relentless strain. The thunder of the Allied guns, the constant assaults, the choking clouds of gas and smoke each day was a battle not only for ground but for survival. Yet despite their losses, the German Second Army under General Fritz von Below clung to its positions. Their orders were clear: defend every yard, counterattack immediately, and make the Allies pay for every foot of soil with blood. German defenses were built for endurance. Dugouts carved deep into the chalk, some 30 feet below the surface, shielded men from even the heaviest shells. Telephone lines ran underground, linking front trenches to artillery batteries in the rear. Machine gun nests were carefully placed to sweep every approach with overlapping fire. Even when villages were reduced to rubble, the cellars and bunkers beneath them became fortresses. A ruined farmhouse could be more dangerous than a fortress, its shattered walls hiding rifles and machine guns. For the German soldiers themselves, the Somme was a torment. Diaries tell of men crouched in the dark of their dugouts, while shells shook the ground above. "We live like moles," one soldier wrote, "buried in the earth waiting for death." Another described the endless bombardments as a storm that tears the soul apart, even when it leaves the body intact. Nerves frayed under the constant hammering. Some men shook uncontrollably, others screamed in their sleep. Yet when the barrage lifted, they climbed the stairs, manned their positions, and opened fire. The German strategy was one of attrition. Commanders believed that Britain's inexperienced army would collapse under the weight of casualties. Every counterattack, no matter how costly, was ordered, with this aim in mind: to prevent the Allies from consolidating gains, to keep the pressure constant, and to show that Germany would not yield. At Pozières Ridge, counterattacks went in again and again, sometimes with little more than grenades and bayonets, often at night, under the light of flares. Many were repelled with heavy losses, but the message was clear: German resistance was unbroken. The human cost was appalling. By August, some German units had lost half their men. Reinforcements arrived, but many were green conscripts thrown into the line with only days of training. Veterans spoke bitterly of replacements who panicked under fire, yet they fought on together. Food and water was scarce. Shells destroyed supply lines, leaving men hungry and thirsty in the heat of summer. "We drink from shell holes," one private confessed, "and the water tastes of iron and blood." Rats infested the trenches, growing fat on the unburied dead. Still, morale did not collapse. German propaganda reassured the troops that Britain was bleeding even more heavily. Commanders pointed to the fields strewn with khaki-clad bodies and insisted that the enemy could not sustain such losses. Some soldiers believed it. Others clung simply to duty, to comradeship, to the desperate instinct to survive. The civilians who had remained under German occupation suffered as well. French families in the Somme Valley endured requisitions of food, labor, and shelter. Their villages, already battered by Allied bombardments, were now strongpoints in the German line. When counterattacks swept through homes became battlegrounds, and families were driven into cellars to wait out the fire. For them, the German defense was not a matter of pride, but of survival amid ruin. By mid-August, the Germans had lost tens of thousands, but they still held firm. Von Bellow's men had proven that even under the heaviest bombardment in history, a determined defense could endure. But the cost was staggering, and it was growing with each week. Behind the front, commanders began to worry that their army was being ground down, its veterans consumed in the endless fire. The question was not whether the Germans could hold today, but whether they could endure tomorrow. The Battle of the Somme was meant to be a thunderbolt, a single blow that would rip open the German line. Instead, as July bled into August, it became a grinding lesson written in blood. For the British Army, untested in battles of this scale, every advance and every failure became a chapter in a brutal education. The men adapted, but each adaptation was purchased at staggering cost. The first lesson was artillery. In June, generals had believed that a week of bombardment would obliterate defenses. By August, they knew better. German dugouts had survived, wire had remained, and machine guns had cut down attackers. The solution was precision, not volume. Observation balloons hovered behind the lines, their crews peering down through telescopes to spot targets. Pilots in fragile biplanes circled overhead, sketching maps and signaling corrections with flares or weighted messages dropped to batteries. Artillery shifted from random saturation to careful targeting, pounding machine gun nests, cutting wire with high explosive shells, and coordinating fire with infantry advances. The second lesson was the creeping barrage. Instead of bombarding for days, gunners now timed their fire to lift in a moving curtain, advancing across no man's land just ahead of the infantry. Soldiers were ordered to keep within 50 yards of the shells, stepping forward as explosions marched in front of them. When it worked, it masked their movement and stunned defenders. When it failed, when infantry lagged, or the barrage moved too fast, it left men exposed or worse, dropped shells among them. Precision was everything, but perfection was rare. Survivors often remembered the terror of chasing their own fire, knowing a single misstep could mean death from friend as well as foe. Small unit tactics also evolved. No longer did men advance in long lines, shoulder to shoulder. Platoons began to move in waves, broken into sections that probed for weak spots. Officers carried detailed maps of German trenches, and sergeants drilled men to fight in smaller groups if leaders were killed. Hand grenades, trench mortars, and Lewis guns gave infantry more flexibility. By necessity, the British Army was learning to fight in a new way. Yet, these lessons were taught in the harshest classroom. Men endured bombardments that shattered nerves as well as bodies. The term shell shock emerged to describe those who trembled uncontrollably, who could no longer speak, who flinched at every sound. Some were sent home, others condemned as cowards, but all bore invisible wounds. One officer wrote that men's nerves are worn as thin as paper, a truth as lethal as any bullet. The physical toll was equally cruel. Trenches flooded in summer storms, filling with mud that clung to boots and weighed men down until they staggered like drunkards. Corpses lay unburied between the lines, swelling in the heat, crawling with rats. Lice infested every seam of clothing. The stench of decay was constant, mingling with the acrid tang of cordite and the sour smell of sweat. We lived like ghosts, one soldier wrote, half buried, half dead, waiting for the guns to find us. The French too refined their methods. Their artillery, heavier and more numerous, proved more effective at breaking defenses. Their colonial troops advanced with discipline, capturing villages and holding them against counterattacks. Their progress on the southern flank contrasted with the British struggle in the north, though the cost was still immense. By August, even the generals understood that there would be no breakthrough. Haig still hoped for decisive results, but his army was being reshaped not by plans but by the demands of the battlefield. Attrition had become the only strategy to bleed the Germans until they could bleed no more. Each village taken, each ridge secured, was not a step toward victory, but another turn of the screw grinding down both armies in equal measure. For the men in the line, the words attrition and strategy meant little. What they knew was mud exhaustion and fear. They carried on because there was no choice, because their comrades depended on them, because orders demanded it. And as the summer turned to autumn, the lessons of the Somme would set the stage for what came next: new armies, new weapons, and new hopes born, always from the same relentless cost. The Somme was not only Britain's trial by fire, it was the crucible of its empire. Across the long front, troops from the dominions and colonies bore their share of the burden, their sacrifices measured in thousands of dead left scars that shaped national memory for generations. The Australians entered the line at the end of July, their first major action on the Western Front. Their target was Pozieres, a village perched on a ridge that gave commanding views of the battlefield. For 2 weeks, the Australians fought through bombardments so intense that survivors later said they were worse than Gallipoli. German artillery fell with relentless accuracy, churning the village into rubble and the fields around it into a lunar landscape of craters. Men who survived spoke of ground that seemed alive with fire and iron, of days when the air itself was made of steel. By the time Pozieres was secured, more than 20,000 Australians were dead or wounded. The ridge was theirs, but at a cost that seared itself into the Australian soul. To the east, the South African Brigade was sent into Delville Wood, a dense patch of forest soon blasted into splinters. They were ordered to hold it at all costs. For 6 days, they clung to shattered stumps and muddy craters, repelling counterattack after counterattack. Shells reduced the trees to blackened poles, and corpses carpeted the ground. Out of nearly 200 South Africans who entered the wood, barely 750 emerged unscathed. Survivors described the forest as a vision of hell, where the cries of the wounded never ceased, and where every step sank into mud mixed with blood. Delville Wood became etched into South Africa's national memory as both tragedy and testament. In September, the Canadians took their place in the line. At Courcelette, they fought alongside the first British tanks, pushing through trenches with bayonets and grenades. The battle was fought yard by yard, dugout by dugout, in a chaos of smoke and mud. One Canadian officer wrote that men fought like wolves in the dark clearing bunkers, with revolvers and fists when ammunition ran out. The The victory at Courcelette was limited, but it marked the Canadians as a formidable force, one that would play a decisive role later at Vimy Ridge and Passchendaele. The New Zealanders too paid dearly. At Flers, they advanced behind tanks in one of the most ambitious assaults of the campaign. They captured trenches and pushed further than expected, but German artillery pinned them down. By the time they withdrew, more than 7,000 New Zealanders had fallen in just over a month. For a small nation, it was a staggering loss, one that touched nearly every community back home. Indian regiments, serving alongside British divisions, carried supplies, manned trenches, and fought in supporting roles. Their presence reminded everyone that this was not simply a European war. It was global, pulling in men from across the colonies. Letters home from sepoys spoke of rain mud and unending fire, describing conditions far removed from their villages in Punjab or Bengal. For the Dominions, the Somme was more than a battle. It was a test of identity. Australians, Canadians, New Zealanders and South Africans fought not only for Britain but for themselves, forging reputations in blood. Each nation would remember the Somme differently, but all would remember it as a place where their young men proved themselves and where so many never returned. These sacrifices were not forgotten at home. In Melbourne, newspapers printed the names of the dead from Pozières until entire neighborhoods mourned. In Cape Town, the story of Delville Wood became legend, recited at memorial services for decades. In Newfoundland, July the 1st, the day their regiment was destroyed at Beaumont Hamel, remained not as a celebration of nationhood but as a day of remembrance. And in Canada, the memory of Courcelette and the long struggle of 1916 became part of a national story of endurance and pride. On the Somme, the British Empire fought as one, but the cost was borne by many nations, and the grief was shared across oceans. In fields far from home, the Dominions carved their names into history, not with glory alone, but with sacrifice measured in lives cut short. By September 1916, the Battle of the Somme had dragged on for more than 2 months. Tens of thousands had already fallen, and the front had shifted only a few miles. Soldiers trudged through a moonscape of craters and mud, while commanders searched desperately for something, anything that might break the stalemate. On September 15th, they unveiled a new weapon, one that promised to transform the battlefield: the tank. The British had kept their invention secret, disguising it with the code name water carrier. Few infantrymen had even heard of it before that morning. The machine that rolled forward at Flers-Courcelette was unlike anything seen before, an armored box of riveted steel, 30 tons in weight, moving on caterpillar tracks that clanked and ground over the earth. The Mark I tank was slow, barely 2 miles an hour, and often broke down after minutes. Yet when it worked, it was terrifying. German soldiers watched in disbelief as the first tanks lurched across no man's land. Bullets and shrapnel pinged harmlessly off their armor. They crushed barbed wire as if it were straw, rumbled over trenches, and belched fire from 6-pounder guns or multiple machine guns. Infantry advanced in their wake, shielded for the first time from the scything fire that had slaughtered them in July. At Flers, one tank clattered through the village itself, blasting German strongpoints and scattering defenders. That day, British forces advanced nearly 3,000 yards, a dramatic success compared to the inch-by-inch struggle of previous weeks. But the flaws of the new weapon were clear. Of the 49 tanks intended for the assault, fewer than half reached the start line. Engines overheated, tracks broke, and fuel ran out. Some sank into craters too deep to cross. Others ground to a halt in the mud. Crews, poisoned by exhaust fumes inside the cramped steel shells, fought sickness as much as the enemy. German artillery, once the shock wore off, found ways to target them. By nightfall, most of the machines were smoking wrecks scattered across the battlefield. Still, their psychological effect was immense. To British soldiers, the tanks were a glimpse of salvation machines that could smash the wire and silence the machine guns. To German defenders, they were nightmare monsters appearing through the smoke, immune to small arms fire. One account described German soldiers fleeing like rabbits at the sight of the first lumbering giants. The Battle of Flers-Courcelette was not the breakthrough Haig had hoped for. The gains, though real, were limited, but it marked a turning point in the imagination of war. Here was proof that technology could offer something new, that the static slaughter of trench warfare might someday be overcome by machines. The tank was crude, unreliable, and few in number, but it was the ancestor of the armored warfare that would dominate the 20th century, Above the battlefield, change was visible as well. September saw the debut of the German Albatros fighter plane, challenging Allied air superiority and threatening the observation balloons and reconnaissance aircraft that directed artillery fire. For the first time, the air war grew as deadly as the ground war, a duel of innovation and attrition that mirrored the struggle below. For the soldiers on the ground, the tank's arrival was a moment of awe amid despair. We did not know what it was. One infantryman remembered only that it moved where nothing else could. For a brief moment, it seemed the stalemate might be broken. But as the mud closed in and as German resistance stiffened, it became clear that the Somme would not end in a single blow. The new machines had come too late and in too few numbers to save the battle. Yet the world had changed. On September 15, 1916, the tank entered history. The Somme, already a byword for sacrifice, had also become the birthplace of mechanized war. By the time September gave way to October, the Somme had already consumed tens of thousands of lives. Yet the battle dragged on, stretching into autumn, as commanders searched for momentum. What met the soldiers instead was the oldest enemy of all the weather. Rain swept across northern France, soaking the trenches and turning the churned earth into an ocean of mud. The ground, already cratered by millions of shells, became impassable. Shell holes filled with water, some so deep that men and horses drowned in them. Trenches collapsed into foul ditches, and duckboards sank under the weight of traffic. Boots stuck fast, pulling away from feet, while wagons and guns bogged down until even teams of horses could not drag them free. Men who fell wounded often could not rise again, and more than a few suffocated slowly in the mire. Still, the fighting continued. Villages such as Gueudecourt-les-Baux and Le Transloy became the next objectives. Each was little more than rubble, yet each was defended with ferocity. German counterattacks came without warning, sometimes driving the Allies back, sometimes dissolving in shellfire. The pattern was familiar: artillery bombardment, infantry assault, counterattack, renewed bombardment, an endless cycle of destruction. For every few hundred yards gained, thousands of lives were lost. Civilians who had managed to survive in the Somme Valley faced their own devastation. What had once been farms and homesteads were now nothing but ruins. Families packed what belongings they could into carts and trudged west, joining long columns of refugees. For them, liberation meant little when their villages had ceased to exist. One French farmer, watching his family's home collapse under shellfire, muttered that there is nothing left to return to, only ashes. For the soldiers, exhaustion became a constant companion. The endless mud, the rain, the cold, it gnawed at their will as much as the shells did. "We are like ghosts," one private wrote, "wandering in a land that is no longer a land." Letters carried home spoke of sleepless nights, of lice and rats, of comrades buried hastily in shallow graves, washed open by the rain. Chaplains described men who no longer spoke, who stared blankly at the ground as if already half dead. Medical services strained under the weight. Ambulance wagons jolted through flooded tracks, carrying men whose bandages were soaked through before they reached aid stations. In field hospitals, surgeons worked with boots caked in mud, their instruments dulled by overuse. A nurse recalled the smell as a mix of blood gas and rot impossible to forget. By November, the weather worsened further. Frost rimed the edges of trenches, and sleet lashed the faces of men already shivering in their greatcoats. The mud turned hard at night, only to thaw again by day, sucking men down into its grip. Still, Haig ordered fresh attacks. At Beaumont Hamel, Scottish units were finally sent to capture positions that had been objectives on the very first day. They succeeded, but the victory was hollow, hundreds more dead for ground that had been promised in July. On November 18th, after 140 days of battle, the guns finally fell silent. The Somme was over. The Allies had advanced 6 miles at most. The Germans, though battered, still held strong defensive lines. The dream of a breakthrough had dissolved into 4 months of attrition. What remained was a landscape: unrecognizable villages, erased forests, shredded fields gouged into seas of mud and craters, and tens of thousands of bodies buried or left unburied in the soil. The Somme had become not a battlefield but a wasteland. When the Battle of the Somme finally ended on November 18, 1916, the numbers told a story more devastating than any communique could soften. In 140 days of continuous fighting, the Allies had advanced no more than 6 miles. The price of that ground was nearly unimaginable. Britain and its empire suffered about 420,000 casualties. France, still reeling from Verdun, lost another 200,000. Germany's toll was estimated between 430,000 and 500,000, perhaps higher. In all, more than 1 million men were killed, wounded, or missing. For Britain, the Somme was a national wound. The shock of July the 1st had already scarred communities, but the months that followed deepened the trauma. Entire generations of young men were gone. Villages in northern England, Scotland, and Wales carried grief for decades, each churchyard a reminder of that summer. The Pals Battalions, once celebrated as symbols of unity, had been destroyed together, leaving entire neighborhoods hollowed out. The Somme became less a battle than a memory of loss, woven into the fabric of daily life. For France, the Somme was proof that Britain would finally bear its share of the burden. At Verdun, the French had bled almost to breaking. The British sacrifice at the Somme, though costly, gave France the ally it desperately needed, an army now willing to endure the same horror. Yet for French civilians in the valley, the battle meant ruin. Villages were erased, farms turned to wasteland, and families scattered west as refugees. Liberation was promised, but devastation was delivered. For Germany, the Somme was both a defense and a disaster. Their lines had held, but at terrible cost. Tens of thousands of veterans men who could not be replaced lay dead in the chalk and mud. The strain forced German commanders to rethink strategy. They would build the Hindenburg Line, a shorter, stronger defense meant to conserve manpower, and they would gamble on new tactics at sea, unrestricted submarine warfare, an act that would bring the United States into the war. In this way, the Somme's echo carried across the Atlantic, shaping America's eventual entry into the conflict. The battle also changed the nature of war itself. Armies learned lessons at terrible cost: how to coordinate artillery with infantry, how to use aircraft for spotting, how to move in smaller units rather than long lines. The first tanks had made their debut crude and unreliable, yet they had shown a glimpse of the future. The Somme was a graveyard, but it was also a laboratory shaping the grim efficiency of modern mechanized conflict. Above all, the Somme revealed the scale of human endurance and the fragility of human life under industrial war. Survivors carried with them memories they could never erase: the cries of the wounded in no man's land, the sight of friends cut down in seconds, the smell of bodies left unburied in the mud. Families at home carried grief that shaped their lives long after the war ended. Communities in Britain, France, Germany, and the Dominions all bore the weight of absence of futures stolen before they began. Historians still debate whether the Somme was necessary. Did it relieve Verdun? Did it bleed Germany enough to matter? Was it, as some claimed, a victory of attrition? Or was it, as others insist, a futile waste lions led by donkeys? The truth may lie between. The Somme did not break the German army, but it crippled its capacity to wage unlimited war. It did not liberate France, but it bound Britain to the struggle until the end. For Britain, for Germany, for France, and eventually for the United States, the Somme stands as a warning. It showed that modern war was not about swift victories, but about grinding endurance where entire landscapes could be consumed and entire generations could vanish in a single campaign. More than a century later, the name still carries the weight of mudfire and sacrifice. The Somme was not won or lost in the traditional sense. It was endured. And in that endurance, the world glimpsed the full horror of industrial warfare, a horror that would shape the rest of the 20th century.